jump right into it. Thank you so much, everyone. We are going to have a huge crowd today. The topic is one that I thought would draw several people. So this one is more than just talk, race more than just talk, specifically focused on the myth of race today. So welcome to those of you who are here for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who have been here before. I appreciate that many of you did send in questions ahead of time. And so we got lots of questions that people have asked. We hope we can get to all of them within the hour. Additionally, if any questions come to your mind, you should see at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar the Q&A. So please put your questions in Q&A, not in chat, because once chat gets information in it, it moves and we might miss it. You also will see on your screen Jen Marshall, who is my office manager and also the producer of these Zoom forums. So Jen will be watching for the questions, and in addition to the questions I will ask Dr. Graves directly, I will then stop every now and then and ask Jen if she had any questions that have come in. So let me share with you the background of our guest today. And in order to do that, you don't need to see me. I prefer that you just see Dr. Graves. So our guest today is Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr., Professor of Biological Sciences, Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University, which is right here in Greensboro, North Carolina. Dr. Graves received his Ph.D. in environmental, evolutionary, and systematic biology. In 1994, he was elected a Fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2012, he was chosen as one of the sensational 60, commemorating 60 years of the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Award. In 2017, he was listed as an outstanding graduate in biology at Oberlin College and was an Innovator of the Year in U.S. Black Engineer magazine. His research is in the evolutionary genomics of adaptation. He'll tell us what that is. He is the author of several books, including several New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium. And the other book is The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America. His latest book, Race and Racism, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, will be launched this fall. I can't wait for it to get out. I hope I will be the first person to get a copy of it. A sampling of what he does in his spare time, don't know how he even finds any spare time, but a sampling of some of what he is doing and has done is Dr. Graves leads programs addressing underrepresentation of minorities in science, and he has served on the Racial Reconciliation and Justice Commission and the COVID Vaccination Task Force of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina. Welcome, Dr. Graves.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast today.
I am delighted that you are here. And as I said, there are several questions. So let's start with actually what I know you've been working on is in the area of nanoscience and nanoengineering. Help us understand what that is.
Okay, so nanoscience and nanoengineering, the important thing to understand is the prefix nano. Nano refers to objects or materials that have one dimension on the order of 1/10,000,000th of a meter. So these are really small things. And what's interesting about when materials are on the nano scale is the properties of those materials take on new characteristics that you would not have predicted from their properties on the bulk scale, meaning dimensions higher than maybe a millionth of a meter. And so nanomaterials are used now in a variety of applications, including your cell phones, your televisions, general electronic communication, computers, and so forth.
Got it. What got you interested in this field, broadly speaking?
Well, actually, I wasn't interested in that field. I'm still not interested in that field. My field is the genomics of adaptation. So when I started school, we would have called it the genetics of adaptation because we didn't have the sequencing tools to actually determine the nucleotide sequence of the DNA involved in the genetic characteristics of organisms. Now, with what are called next generation sequencing, we can literally examine the nucleotide sequence of organisms and how that changes in response to the environment. So those changes in response to the environment we call adaptation. And so what I study are the genetic changes resulting from adaptation to things in the environment. And what got me interested in nanoscience was that these new nanomaterials were being used in the environment and organisms were being exposed to them. So beginning in around 2014, I started research outlining the potential dangers of the exposure of living things to these nanomaterials and how they would adapt to them. And so my laboratory was actually the first laboratory in the world to show that bacteria could evolve resistance to silver nanoparticles. And as such, in the last 7 years, my research group has been working on how bacteria manage to do adaptation to both ionic and nanomaterial scale metals.
Okay. So you're looking at things in a scale that most people can hardly even comprehend. And I appreciate learning what that is, because that also then helps begin to lay the foundation about what we're going to talk about relative to DNA and what it can tell us and what it can't tell us and that type of thing. So one of the first questions that we received is, what is biological, let me read it right. What is biological race versus socially, I'll be able to read in a minute. What is biological race versus socially constructed race from a scientific perspective? What's the difference?
All right, so to do that, I'm going to share my screen.
You bet.
If you don't mind. And so hopefully everyone can see. I'm going to make that full screen. And first, I'm going to give you, your viewers, a little background. I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s. And so the first book that I wrote about this was The Emperor's New Clothes, which provides the reader with a history of how racial thinking came into existence in Western society. And it goes back literally to the ancients, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, and traces the development of racial thought through to the 21st century. The second book, The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, assumes that you know that history, and it takes off trying to explain the ongoing social pathology that exists in our society because of these false beliefs about human biological differences and the social conception of race. Now, when I wrote The Race Myth in 2004 and updated it in 2005, I honestly hoped I would never have to write another book about race again, because the answers in The Race Myth are really clear. And for anybody who has an open mind and a modicum of education, you should have been able to read the race myth and understand why humans don't have biological races and the difference between biological race concept and the socially defined race concept. Now, it turns out that both of these books, while well regarded in academic circles, never really made it in the public sphere. So the Emperor once was at number 100 on Amazon, which, is an accomplishment, but still never made it into the top 10 as it should have. So now, Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, was written with my colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman, who is a professor of anthropology and a former president of the American Anthropological Association, to answer these questions that people keep bombarding us with about race over the last 30 years of our career, and to give people some clear and concise answers. And we hope this one actually will get read, because quite frankly, our country is headed towards a racial apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And if we don't get these issues clear, I'm afraid that that's exactly what's going to happen. So now, to get to the answer about racism or race, biological and social, okay, I'm pretty sure, here we go. Now, the biological race concept actually was not developed specifically to deal with human beings. It is a concept that helps us to understand the amount of biological and genetic information within any species. So in fact, when biologists began to think about variation within species, that was in a serious way, was in the 18th century. So the first book that begins to have this discussion is a book by Carolus Linnaeus, Swedish botanist. And in his book, Systema Naturae, he didn't talk about human beings until the 10th edition, which was published in 1758. So the prior 9 editions, he didn't talk about humans at all, but he did talk about variation. And so the biological race concept has gone through 4 iterations of its criteria, starting with what individuals look like. What in genetics we call the phenotype. Okay, so looking at individuals within any species and then saying, can we classify them on the basis of what they look like? Now, going into the 19th century, the biological race concept began to shift from what organisms look like to where they came from. And so it had a geographical basis. And this was mainly due to the work of the Swiss-born American zoologist, blowing my mind right now again, Louis Agassiz, who was the founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. But Agassiz was strongly adverse to African bodies. And so his ideas on geographical location were strongly influenced by his dislike of people of dark skin of African ancestry. And so his geographical location was one in which he felt that God had created zones of adaptation. And so there were tropical zones, there were northern zones, there were oceanic zones, and species, including humans, were supposed to stay in their zones. Okay, so both of the first 2 concepts of race were based upon religious ideas. They were not evolutionary at all. The next concept associated with biological race was population-based, and this had to do with the frequency of genes within populations within a species. Now, this was explicitly evolutionary and was associated with the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 21st century. This synthesis involved uniting natural selection theory, which had been developed beginning with Charles Darwin, and population genetics, which starts with Gregor Mendel. And so bringing these 2 things together, you have an understanding of how the prevalence or frequency of genes change in environments on the basis of natural selection. And so these ideas of biological race are based upon the prevalence of genes within and between populations. Finally, at the end of the 20th century, using new methods of phylogenetic analysis in which we look at the lineages of populations, the cladistic race concept asks whether any group within a species can be considered a unique evolutionary lineage. Now, the last two concepts are clearly evolutionary. The first two were special creationists, and these could be applied to any species, including humans. Now, it turns out that when we use the last two criteria and apply it to data on humans, we unambiguously conclude that human beings do not have biological races. So if we use these criteria uniformly across all the species on this planet, humans are one of the species that don't have biological races. Some species do. So happens we don't. Now, this has to be sharply differentiated from the socially defined or socially constructed race concept. This concept arbitrarily utilized aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, or any other thing you could throw in the mix, but it always did so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, the only reason this concept of race came into existence was to determine who had access to resources and rights within a society and who did not. Okay, the two are often conflated. Most people, when they talk about race, actually mean the second thing, but they act as if it relates to the first thing, when in fact they're not the same at all. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and you can move to our next question.
Great. And I know Jen has a couple of questions that I think you've touched on the answer, but I want her to ask the questions just the way they were sent in. Jen?
Absolutely. So the first one is, why do we use the terms white or black when Anglos are not white and most African Americans are not black? What's the origin of that phrase?
Okay, so the origin of these phrases are social definitions. So whiteness is a social definition, is not a biological concept. Okay, and you're absolutely correct. You know, people of African descent have a variety of skin complexions, and none of them are actually black. And in fact, since skin complexion is determined by the historical exposure to solar radiation, the African continent has a greater diversity of skin complexions than any other place on this planet. And that's simply because Africa runs through more lines of latitude than any other portion of this planet. So to think that Africans have black skin is nonsensical. Africans have a whole variety of skin complexions. And African Americans, due to the European admixture, have a variety of skin color complexions. Okay, now I want to be clear for folks in the audience. Skin color complexion is determined mainly by 5 genes out of 20,000 protein coding genes. There are some subsidiary genes, probably, you know, more than a dozen or so, that will modify these major 5 genes, but skin color complexion is in fact a tiny fraction of the human genome. Okay, 5 genes out of 25,000. You do the math. Okay, so white and black are social conventions that have nothing to do with our actual biology. Now, these social conventions, let me finish one quick thing. These social conventions actually came into use after the voyages of Columbus. So when you read, for example, the narratives of the Crusades, Europeans who went to the Middle East to fight didn't describe people as white or black. They described people as Christian or Muslim. So again, these social conceptions and social definitions are historically contingent and contextual.
Well, and what came to my mind, I know, Jen, you have another question. What came to my mind as you were talking about that, though, is the labels, black or white, that they change over time as well. I mean, as African Americans, we weren't always referred to as black. I mean, when I was a kid, it was the acceptable terms was Negro, then it went to Afro-American, then it's, no, Afro is a hairstyle. So it went to African American, and then also black. And the question I get asked at almost every presentation as it relates to black folks is, which term is correct? Well, both are, because all black people are not African American, and some African Americans don't prefer to be called African American, they prefer black. So back to your point of there's not really biological race. This is all socially constructed. It comes up over time with various folks. And what I share is, people of any particular culture or any particular group have the right to name their own group. So, how much does it take? How much time does it take to say one or both and use various terms interchangeably, as long as they're all respectful terms to be used? So thank you. I know Jen has another question.
Yes, I do. And that actually, discussing terms leads quite nicely into the next question, because the question is, what is the correct way that we should refer to race?
Okay, so again, this comes to which race concept are you talking about? So in my academic work and popular writing, I'm always careful to identify which race concept I'm talking about. So if I'm talking about biological race concept, then number one, humans don't have biological races. So the more appropriate terms are specific populations from the sense of population genetics. And that in and of itself is not a simple thing to define. So when we're talking about the social definitions of race, then it has to do with context. So for example, on my birth certificate, it says colored. I was born in Westfield, New Jersey. I mean, parents lived in Westfield, New Jersey. I was born in Muhlenberg Hospital in Plainfield, New Jersey, and the birth certificate says colored. Now, I don't know if that was because the hospital filled in that word, or whether my mother, and unfortunately my mother's passed on, so I can't ask her that question now, whether my mother filled in that word. But I know that when we were growing up, okay, when we were small children, the term used in our household was colored people. Okay? But historically, terms, as Lenora just said, historically those terms have changed from generation to generation to generation. After James Brown came out with "I'm Black and I'm Proud" in 1968, I was black. Okay, and then when I went to college, I was an Afro-American. And then after college, I was an African American. So all these things are contextual, and so there is no correct term.
Yeah, that's right.
Again, it comes down to understanding the historical social context.
So I have a comment that's just a nuance as I keep discovering how much we have in common in regards to where we've lived and that type of thing. So as I was born in Newark, New Jersey, and one of the things that has nothing to do with race or ethnicity, at least I don't think it does, but one of the things that's peculiar to people who were born in North Jersey is that when they, myself included, when I meet someone who was born like in Newark, they don't say to me, "So what part of Newark did you live in?" They always ask, "What hospital were you born in?" And when you identified the hospital where you were born, it's like, I know I was born in Beth Israel. I have no idea why that's important, but when I'm speaking to people from New Jersey, that is how they identify themselves. I thought that was just very peculiar to that. I've not heard anybody from any other part of the country describe their origin that way. So yet another factor on how complex we are as human beings. So next question, to complicate matters even further, describe for us what ethnicity is. A lot of people use race and ethnicity as though they're the same.
Yeah, that's a huge error. Just don't understand. That's a huge error. The term ethnicity refers to a common national origin, language, culture, or religion. Okay, so the term biological race clearly doesn't apply to ethnicity. Socially defined race can overlap with ethnicity, but that's also not the same thing. And so you see on NIH documents, they use race ethnicity as if those are equivalent terms. And they're in fact not at all, and they're just adding to the confusion. So one of the things I've been working on recently is I've been working with the publisher of one of the most widely used medical textbooks in pathology, Elsevier, for their Robbins Basic Pathology, trying to clarify in its pages all of these ridiculous conflations that exist in popular culture, but you can't have them exist in a textbook of pathology. And so the answer is ethnicity is not socially defined race, nor is it biological race. They're very different concepts.
So you could, oftentimes we see on those forms where they're separating out ethnicity, which seems to apply, or they want it to apply, primarily to the Latinx population. Because it confuses me when I see that on identifying ethnicity, and also are you a Black Latino or non-Black Latino?
Okay, so I have a slide because I anticipated that question, so let me share the slide. Okay, so let's go back over here and share, and let's go full screen. So the use of this, again, the term ethnicity when it comes to Latinx people is, again, an indication of how unserious the government and professional organizations are when it comes to injustice. Because if they were serious, they would learn how to straighten out their language and their concepts and their conceptions. And so this is a study that was done from data collected by 23andMe on the ancestry, meaning the percentage of the genome which is capable of being different. So one of the things I want to point out really quickly is that all human beings share 99.1% of their genome in common, meaning everybody in the world has that nucleotide conception or composition at 99.1% of their genome. That means that 0.9% of the genome is different between individuals. Now, when you have a genome that's composed of 3.3 billion base pairs, that 0.9 is not a small number, but it is a small percentage. Now, within that small percentage of, and I think I calculated that it's around 280 million base pairs, within that 280 million base pairs, most of that is shared across the world. May be different amongst individuals, but it's shared across the world. Okay, a small percentage of that, about 5%, is localized to the geographic origin of your ancestry. So we can use that to calculate ancestry percentages for individuals. And so this may also answer a question that's coming up: is what is the difference between race? What is the difference between ancestry? Okay, we have ancestry from different portions of the globe. That doesn't mean we have biological races. So anyway, this 23andMe study showed that people who are defined as Latinx in the United States have between 65 to 85% European ancestry. They have, on the other hand, between 15 and 35% Amerindian ancestry and or African ancestry, depending upon which region of Latin America they come from. And I'm going to show that in the next slide. So if you come from Puerto Rico, and these are average figures. I want to be clear, these are average figures. On average, you are 72% European ancestry, about 12% African ancestry, and about 16% Amerindian ancestry. Now notice how different that is from Mexico. In Mexico, you're about 51% Amerindian ancestry, about 48% European ancestry, and only about 3% African ancestry. Now, the reason why these numbers are so different is because of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was manifested in the Caribbean and in the eastern portions of the United States, but not in Mexico. And hence, Mexicans have very little African ancestry. Now, if you look at Colombia, we're going to zoom into Colombia on the next slide, okay? These plots tell you about the amount of African, European, and Amerindian ancestry that these sample people have. So Medellin is a state in Colombia, and you're probably familiar with it because of the, the drug cartels that come out of Medellin. But the people who live in Medellin have a predominantly European ancestry, but a large fraction of Amerindian ancestry, but very little African ancestry. Choco is the neighboring state to Medellin that had plantation agriculture and therefore enslaved people from Africa. People in Choco have the same genetic ancestry profile as African Americans do. In other words, about 85% African, a much smaller percentage of European ancestry, and a significant Amerindian ancestry, much more than African Americans do. And so again, Latinx ethnicity is not the same as genetic ancestry, because depending upon what region of Latin America and what country, because Latinx really means that you speak Spanish. And Spain, conquered and colonized all sorts of places in the Mediterranean, I'm sorry, not the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean. So your genetic ancestry can be quite different depending upon which island or which country you came from.
Wow, got it. I don't know about all of you who are viewing this, but I know I'm going to watch this several times so that I can really digest this and go back to it. And we have the post caption as well, because I'm really appreciating learning the correct terms and how all of this has come about. Now, I had another question further down the list, but given what you just said, I think I need to ask it now. So is it worthwhile for African Americans in particular, but really for anyone, to spend the money for 23andMe or the other one, Ancestry, Ancestry.com?
Okay, so again, we'll go back and share the screen one more time. So we're going to go up to ancestry testing for African Americans. Okay, so again, this is a study that came out of data from 23andMe and was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2015. So when we look at African Americans across the United States, their African ancestry differs depending upon the region in which those people live. And so you'll note in West Virginia that map is like blank. Now, there are African Americans living in West Virginia, but they have an extremely high level of European ancestry, similar to Washington State, where people there often are, on average, 50% European ancestry and 50% African ancestry. Now, that is starkly different from what we see in South Carolina. South Carolina people are about 85% African ancestry and only about 15% European ancestry. And so across the country, since most African Americans, have their origin as enslaved people in what used to be called the Black Belt or the former Confederate States, the mean African ancestry is about 84%, and the mean European ancestry is 16%. Now, it's really important to understand that European ancestry came into African Americans as a result of chattel slavery. And this was not a consensual relationship between enslaved African women and their white slave masters. They were forced into having children with these men who were then, by law, defined as being Negro or enslaved people. Okay? After slavery ended, the United States enacted very strict laws against what was called miscegenation or race mixing. And of course, tens of thousands of African American men were brutally murdered by lynching for even looking in the direction of a woman of European descent. So the past history explains this European admixture in African Americans. Now, different companies use different genetic marker panels to further investigate African ancestry. We know that most enslaved people in the transatlantic slave trade came from two major regions in Africa, and that is the area along what was called the Gold Coast and the area of central southern Africa, which are shown in the map on the right. Now, 23andMe defines these genetic markers as Senegambian, coastal West African, Nigerian, and Congolese. And when you look at the samples of people from Texas to Massachusetts, you see that in North America, it looks as if there's a large percentage of Nigerian ancestry, followed by coastal West African in African Americans. But the simple fact of the matter is that all African Americans have different mixtures of these four major groups. Now, the reason this happened was because once these people were enslaved in chattel slavery, within a generation or so, they began to intermarry. And so while we know that our average genetic ancestry amongst African Americans is 84% African, it's also well admixed between the founding populations that came from Africa. Now, quite frankly, I've never had my DNA tested to find out these percentages because we already knew that before these tests became available. In other words, historical documents told us that African Americans came from those regions in Africa, that they then intermarried with each other across their original, ethnic groups, and that all African Americans have different percentages of those four major regions within their genome. So why you would pay somebody money to tell you that, I quite frankly don't know.
So what I'm hearing is, if we wanted to find out specifically if we're mostly Ethiopian, those tests really aren't going to tell us.
You would never find that because Ethiopia didn't give people to the transatlantic.
Right, that's why I chose that particular thing. So it really is just not going to tell us.
And neither did Nubia. So when people, when Oprah claimed that she was Nubian, that was because the African Ancestry Genetics Company did their genetics wrong, because no Nubians were included in the transatlantic slave trade, nor were Kenyans. And so an interesting thing is that Barack Obama is actually more closely related to persons of European descent than he is to persons of African American ancestry in the United States, because his father was from Kenya. Okay.
And it was that. Okay.
And Kenyans are more closely related to Europeans than they are to West Africans.
So now that we have the foundation of race, socially constructed race, and some information, understanding of ethnicity, etc., talk to us about how socially constructed race impacts healthcare. I deal a lot with different healthcare systems, and one of the things we talk about is bias within healthcare, and it ends up being life or death. Speak to that for us, please.
Okay, again, we'll go back to the screen because I've been heavily invested in trying to sort this stuff out for some time now. Okay, so we're going to go up. So the problem, as I pointed out, is that this country has not had any serious investment in dealing with racial discrimination and injustice. And so therefore has not ever paid careful attention to that in education. So the only way you would know the things that I'm telling you now is if you when you went to college, if you took a course in either evolutionary biology, population genetics, or physical anthropology, that's where you would learn those things. The vast majority of students who go to American universities don't ever take those courses. Okay, so students in business, students in engineering, students in medicine, they would never take those courses. And so when they go to medical school, they're being taught by doctors and professors who never took those courses. And so here is a survey on racial beliefs amongst residents, first, second, and third year students at the University of Virginia. Now, the University of Virginia is a premier medical school. And here are some of the things that the medical students believed when they came to medical school. Blacks age more slowly than whites. 33% of first-year medical students thought that. Nerve endings less sensitive than whites. 12.7% of first-year medical students thought that. Black blood coagulates more quickly than whites. 46% of first-year medical students thought that. Black skin is thicker than white. 63.5% of first-year medical students thought that. Blacks have a stronger immune system than whites. 33.3% of first-year medical students thought that. Now, how you could think that given the historical overrepresentation of blacks in America with infectious disease, I'm at a loss.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the good news is that the UVA medical curriculum by third year generally reduce these misconceptions. But you'll note they don't completely disappear. So third year med students still 23.3% of them think that blacks age more slowly than whites, even though black people have lower lifespan in America than whites do. They did get rid of the black nerve endings less sensitive part, and they dramatically reduced the black blood coagulates part, but the black skin is thicker than white. Still 37.3% of medical students in their third year believe that. Now, amongst the residents didn't necessarily get educated at UVA.
No.
And these residents are also teaching these medical students. So 50% of the residents thought black aged more slowly than whites. 100% of them thought black skin was thicker than whites. Now, the other thing I found in this paper, which was written actually to try to dispel these racial misconceptions, is that the authors of this paper also had racial misconceptions in their paper that they thought were true, such as differences in bone density, which is in fact false, but they thought it was true. So even these people who were trying to address these misconceptions in medical education were getting it wrong. So to that end, for the last, I would say, 10 years, I've been actively working to try to help redress these ongoing misconceptions. So I'll tell you about two things that I'm doing. If you look at this, oh, sorry, that's actually not on the screen. So I'm on the executive board of the International Society for Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health, ISEM. And by the way, our professional meeting is in July. And for anybody who's a physician who's listening, I strongly invite you to come to our conference. Since it's online, it's only $10. So you can register, and you'll learn a lot about the things that I'm talking about today at the ICEMP conference. And so one of the things that I've been working on through ICEMP is, one, dispelling these false ideas in medical education, dispelling these false ideas in medical clinical practice, trying to bring to the forefront research on racialized health disparities, not just in the United States, but across the world. The other thing I'm doing now with Elsevier is I'm a consultant doing the revision of the 11th edition of Robbins' Basic Pathology, and also their 3D human anatomy project, which influenced a lot of people across the world. But the answer is, and the final thing is, I've been doing a lot of grand rounds at medical schools. So I've spoken this year at UCSF, I've spoken at Emory, I'll be speaking at, we've spoken at Duke, we'll be speaking at Johns Hopkins in the fall. So we're hard at work trying to help medical education right its ship. But again, you know, this raises an amazing question of, why did it take George Floyd being murdered on television for medicine to finally figure out, oh, we've been doing this wrong for the last 200 years?
Well, the challenge is absolutely more people at every level of their medical education need to get the facts, and then to really help them get beyond the biases that they had, is that kind of information and that kind of the positive reinforcement of what the facts are is necessary. So you know, one of the challenges that I run into regularly, as do other people doing this work, is that organizations want you to come in and deliver a presentation for an hour, maybe an hour and a half, but then they don't do anything, even after it's brought to their attention, of how these discrepancies, the disparity in healthcare among, or rather as it relates to socially constructed race, I'm trying to learn to say it correctly, they don't really do anything to perpetuate the accurate information and to disrupt the biases. So I mean, I don't mean to say that broadly. I know some are doing much more work than others. Absolutely. So what is that?
I'm holding up a book here. It's on philosophy and medicine. This book was published in 2002. Mutating Concepts, Evolving Disciplines, Genetics, Medicine, and Society. This was one of my first papers explaining the race and disease fallacy. So I've literally been writing on this for 20 plus years.
For a long time.
All three of the books that I've showed you at the beginning of this presentation have chapters on race and disease fallacy. I've written probably 30 academic papers on this subject in top tier journals. The Emperor was reviewed in JAMA when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
But the simple fact of the matter is that people aren't reading this.
Yeah.
And they're not reading it because it wasn't important to them.
That's right.
Not because the information is not there. It has to be important to you.
Yes, yes, yes. Change doesn't happen until people get uncomfortable with the status quo, which means they have to get curious about these things. We have several more questions, and of course, not a lot of time. And some of the questions have to do with actions, questions about actions people can take. So I want to ask a couple more questions and then get into the action questions. So one, which is a question I get asked often, I'm interested in your answer. Can Black people, now that we understand what race is, or isn't, can Black people be racist?
Yeah, so that goes to a fundamental confusion between two concepts, bigotry and racism. Mm-hmm. So let me first explain bigotry. Anyone can be a bigot, okay? And bigots make a logical fallacy called the fallacy of division. And in the fallacy of division, they attribute supposed traits of a group to any of its individual members. Now, if you have biased and stereotypical views of the group, you then hold those same views for any individual within the group. And anybody can do that. Racism, on the other hand, requires that you have the social power to implement policies based upon your bigotry and prejudice. And so in that regard, African Americans have very few opportunities to be racist in American society, because American society is controlled in the main by persons of European descent.
Mhm. So clearly, anyone could be a bigot, but not everyone can be racist because it has to do with power.
It has to do with power, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if this is a short answer, but I need to try to make it short if possible. How does the myth of race compare to class and caste systems in other countries?
There's a really excellent book, and I forgot the name of the author, on caste. I think her last name is Wilkerson.
Yes,
And
it is fabulous. I just finished reading it.
Yeah, she makes a really good case that the way socially defined race has been implemented in America is very similar to the caste systems that we see around the world, in particular places like India. And so in America, we have socially defined race, and it functions to limit the opportunities of individuals in a number of ways, with regard to the neighborhoods you're born in, the nutrition you get, the exposure to environmental toxins that you experience, the exposure to psychological trauma on the basis of events in your life. All those things are deeply associated with socially defined race, and one's opportunity to enter a higher social class in America is strongly related to socially defined race. And I'll give you a real simple example of that. I am the only African American from my kindergarten class who is still alive. All the rest are dead. Most of them spent time in prison. I haven't spent any time in prison. I'm still alive, but I'm the only one. Okay. So caste is like that in the way it works in India. People are relegated to a certain caste, and their ability to move out of that caste is literally impossible in their system, because if you're born into that caste, it's your family, and you almost never can move out of it. So in that regard, socially defined race in America and caste in India work in very similar ways.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's get to some action questions, meaning people wanting to know some of the things that they can do. One of which is, how do we shift the way people around us feel about different races? How can I make a difference? So what this person is looking for, what could they specifically do?
Well, it depends upon your context. I mean, not everybody can do everything. So one of the reasons why I can be effective is because I have a platform to be effective in my role as being a scholar at a public university. So the first thing you can do is educate yourself on these issues, so you actually know what you're talking about. And in terms of changing people's minds, that's a very difficult thing to do. And if I knew how to do that, I wouldn't have had to write another book on race in 2021, right? Because facts alone are not enough, and that's the unfortunate truth. Because our society reifies and supports racism. And that's something that people have a hard time hearing. This is a white supremacist nation in which its economic and political structures are designed to maintain the supremacy of persons of European descent. And if I told you something different, I would be lying to you, and I try not to lie to people. So you have to first be willing to confront white supremacy. Now, for persons of European descent, that means having difficult conversations with people you know, people in your family, people who are your friends. For example, a very good colleague of mine who's of European descent said, she had to have a very difficult conversation with her sister about the Tulsa massacre of 1921. The sister had never heard that something like that had happened in American history. And so, but she had to have the courage to be willing to do that difficult conversation. So in my own church, I work with our Racial Justice and Reconciliation Commission. And I try to help particularly persons of European descent learn how to have effective conversations with other persons of European descent about structural racism in America. It's not something that happened 100 years ago. It's something that happened 100 years ago and is being manifested and recreated in the present. And unless we take conscientious, dedicated, and determined action, we will have white supremacy in our future. So the answer begins with people being willing to take action. Okay, and I'm going to give one more example of this. As a person who practices the Christian faith, I have learned, and it's not just me, but other people have studied this, that the biggest impediment to racial justice in America right now are white Christians. Now, this is documented in Robert Jones's book, White Too Long. This was well illustrated at this week's convention of the Southern Baptists, in which they reified their support for white supremacy in the resolutions that they adopted. So I argue that if you actually truly believe in the doctrines of Christianity, then you cannot be a racist. And that means that you have to be willing to do the hard work to help undermine structural racism in American society. And I also argue that if white Christians really took on that as a mission, that white supremacy and racism in America could not stand another day.
So I get asked a variation of that, the question I just asked you often. And so to build on what you just said, and clearly the beginning is to educate yourself, and you can't possibly know everything, but read books, watch YouTube, TED Talks, whatever, but educate yourself, particularly around the facts. And the way that I often talk about it is then after you've done some education, then you want to go a little bit deeper, develop your understanding, and be willing to be around people that are different than you, so that you get a sense of what it feels like to be other. And you can do that in lots of different ways, but be around people different than you. Then you're ready to actually have conversation, whether it's a family member or others, is to have conversations with people who are in the groups. Like, for instance, if you're white, first have conversation with Black folks. But remember, that's not the first thing you do. That's the third thing you do. First, you get some information, and then you surround yourself with people in that group. Then start having one-on-one conversations, so that you have a little more of a foundation. And in my view, once you do those three things, then you're less afraid and more able to be an ally or an advocate. Many of you on this call, I know, are in your workplace or you're virtually working, and this question comes up frequently within the organization. How can I learn more? And so often people want to find that one Black person they know, and it doesn't just the Black person. This is Pride Month. You go to the one person who is gay and they're out, and you want to talk to them. They may not always want to talk. Folks are kind of exhausted about this, but if you do the work, get the education, do some things on your own, that's a beginning. So that, going back to the question of how do you talk to other people to help them understand what we've been talking about for this last hour, then instead of trying to convince them in one conversation, because that's not going to happen, rather ask questions. So don't just overload them with the facts that you've learned, because they may interpret that differently, but rather ask them questions. Help me understand why you think that. Let's talk about it. Then you can sprinkle in some facts, and then recognize that everybody doesn't want to change. Everybody doesn't want to learn that information. So we've got time for one more question. Jen, I know you have the list of questions that came in ahead of time. If you would go ahead and ask question 16, because this is another question from the audience.
Absolutely. I would like to know how to break that assumption of what race is with folks who are not Black.
And you touched on this a little bit, but I thought you might want to.
So again, this comes with, as Lenora just pointed out, one, educating yourself so that you can have a informed conversation that's not threatening. And you know, there's a lot of literature that's been written on what's called white fragility, that when people's worldview of the United States as a just nation with good values becomes threatened, you know, they clam up and they don't want to hear what you have to say, because when people begin to realize that their situation is a result of unearned privilege that other people don't have, for people who have a moral core, this becomes a very difficult thing to wrestle with. But I have faith in people who really do have a moral core, but I also know that not a lot of people do. And so, you know, our task now is uniting people who, you know, have a firm commitment to social justice. And I know that not everybody has. And so I'm going to end this question with an example that I think might be helpful. So there was once a very famous cartoon that appeared in syndicated newspapers of a person with a sign over their shoulder, walking back and forth in front of the Pentagon, protesting the Vietnam War. And another person in the panel says, well, why are you doing this? Okay, they're not listening to you. And the person carrying the sign responds, I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for me. And so that's, I think, the attitude we need to take. I mean, when I started this struggle, I was not under the naive delusion that I was going to change the hearts and minds of people who are so deeply wedded to the structural racism and advantages they get from this. But this is something I cannot help but do, because I've always, again, you know, imagined the scenario of where, you know, I have to stand before St. Peter and I have to account for my life. And I've rehearsed this over and over in my mind. And my response is going to be is, you know, I was born into a world that I did not make and whose rules I did not set. But I did my best to try to make that world better.
Better than
that's not enough to get me into heaven. Well, then I guess I'm not getting it.
Well, so two things to close. Oh my goodness. First of all, I think we're going to have you back after your book comes out, because there's still so many more questions. So two things. The first of which is, when is your book launch, so that we can put it on our calendars and get a copy of it?
The exact date of publication is December 7th, 2021. That's, by the way, it's already on Amazon. You can pre-order.
All right, great news. All right.
By the way, just to let you know, there's another book coming in the fall of 2022. I just recently finished my fifth book, entitled Voice in the Wilderness: How Evolution Can Help Us Solve Our Biggest Problems. Excellent. That book is going to be published by Basic Books in 2022, and it's partially autobiographical. So it tells the story of how I became America's first Black evolutionary biologist.
Okay, so you are teasing us. So my next question is, for folks that want to follow you or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that? Is it LinkedIn, or what's the best way?
You can contact me through LinkedIn. If you Google Joseph L. Graves Jr., I am the first person that comes up. So, okay. You know, my email address is there because it's associated with the university. So yeah, I mean, and I do a lot of these, you know, public speaking, public service type things. So, you know, if you have a local organization that you want me to speak to, you know, drop me an email and I'll see if I can make it happen.
It has been absolutely my joy, my pleasure to have you today. I hope that we will be able to do this yet again. There's just so much information to absorb. And I know many of the people that are on this call, so I know they really want to learn and understand, to take that step and then spread the message. So once again, Dr. Graves, thank you so much for carving out time to be with us today. And for those of you who may be wondering, because you have registered for this session, you will get a link to the recording, and feel free to share it far and wide. There's no proprietary around it. I really would like it to go to as many people who are interested. Thanks again, and you'll get a notice when we have the next one scheduled. Bye, everybody. Stay healthy and safe.
Thank you all for your attention today.
Bye, Jen.